Hi, everyone.
Hi, everybody. This is very strange for us to not get any feedback as we say hello to people. We're excited to report out that we've had at least 80 people that have signed up for this program. So I'm going to welcome everybody. I wish I could see all your smiling faces, but as I would on a normal science speaker series night. We're going to wait another minute or two and then we'll get started. We don't have to worry about pulling in chairs from the other room, I guess, and that'll help to keep things going. I guess before we get going, I'll just say a couple of things. As many of you probably know already, is that Mariah Mitchell had to cancel our summer camp programs. Unfortunately, we were pretty devastated having to do that. That's the thing I look forward to the most in the summertime, is welcoming all those interns, and then of course all the kids that attend the camps and the other programs that we do all summer long. So it's about 30 interns that we won't directly be seeing at Mariah Mitchell this summer. And of course, they're very disappointed as well. Our astronomy program is going to continue the research experience for undergraduates, but we're doing that virtually with Dr. Regina Jorgensen leading the charge on that. And we'll be looking toward opening up some programs as the summer goes on, but we're waiting for the governor's orders and guidance in terms of when we can actually open up some of those programs. I'd say at this point, it's pretty unlikely that we'll have our facilities open. One of the advantages, I think, of our facilities is they're very compact, and which makes it really intimate, but the intimacy is not something that we're looking for right now, where we're trying to socially distance. So we'll be looking at some programs we can do outside. I know Jack is looking at some things with outdoor touch tanks. We can bring things out where he'll probably be the only one doing the touching, but at least we can present some of the animals. So we're excited about that, and we're excited about exploring other possibilities. So what I'll say is just stay tuned, keep checking our e-comet, and make sure that if you're interested in knowing what's going on with us, we will be doing the science speaker series at this point online through Zoom throughout the summer. If there's an opportunity to open that up, we'll do that as well, of course. But as with most things right now, we just have to take it 1 week at a time. And I don't know about you all, but for me, every week feels like about a month. So anyway, why don't we move on now? It's 7:02. I want to tell you a couple of things. You're welcome to ask questions anytime through this presentation. There's a Q&A at the bottom right-hand side, and I guess the chat as well. But it's a good way to keep in touch. We'll be looking at the Q&A. So at the end of Jack's presentation, we'll open that up. I'll be looking through the Q&A and feeding them to Jack, or maybe he'll look at a few as well. But we'll try it that way. This is our first Zoom webinar, so we appreciate your patience, and thank you for being here. Lydia, do we know how many people are actually here? Actually I can tell that. It's 38 participants, so I'm thrilled. That's about 3/4 of our room down at 33 filled up now, so that's wonderful. So before I start tonight, I just want to make a brief beginning of a brief statement. And just want to express Mariah Mitchell's sadness and outrage of the events that have happened over the last few days and weeks to our Black community. And I want to let you know that we are working on a full statement that will be in our e-comet on this Monday. So I'd ask you to look for that. And I want to also, as I normally do, I would tell you whether I'd look outside and tell you whether we might have an open night tonight, but unfortunately, that is something we are working on, remote open nights and potentially opening up toward the end of the summer. And I'll say, Jack, what is the weather out tonight? Would we have had an open night tonight, you think?
Doesn't look like it. Pretty cloudy.
All right.
Looks like a nice sunset, though.
Okay, great.
but you probably don't want to look at that
Yeah,
through normal telescopes.
right. So I do want to thank our sponsors for this. At this point, our sponsors are the Osceola Foundation and Act Climate for supporting this speaker series. I also want to thank our members. Without our members, we wouldn't be able to do any of this. Your support is critical to our organization. And I encourage any of you who are not members to join Mariah Mitchell Association. It is the way we offer all these great programs to kids and adults, and the speaker series and everything that we do. Feed the fish, feed the turtles. So thank you for that. So I'd like to introduce Jack. Jack is, if you don't know this, he's an employee and the distinguished member of our team here. He is the manager of the Mariah Mitchell Aquarium. So Jack has been interested in sea creatures since he was a child. He actually began his journey with MMA at age 12. How many years ago was that, Jack? Gotta be 14 years.
I'm gonna plead the fifth on that one.
I'm guessing it's about, I don't know, 14, 15 years ago. And when he first volunteered at the aquarium, he later received a marine science degree at the Evergreen State College and is currently the director of the MMA Aquarium, as I just said. Jack, would you say that your experience at Mariah Mitchell directed you into that field?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, I grew up in New York City, so there wasn't all that much wildlife there. So actually, I think probably the founding sort of spark for my interest in marine science, I went on a marine ecology field trip, I think when I was 11, and then I volunteered at the aquarium the next summer and was just in love and couldn't stop coming back. So
that's great. Yeah, we love these stories, and we have a lot of stories like that. And I just love talking to folks who went on and followed a career in science or science education as a result of the work at Mariah Mitchell. Jack's research background includes goby shrimp symbiosis, green crab population dynamics, and comb jelly physiology. He's really passionate about his work. I know all winter long, he studies, he gets as many experiences as he can out in the ocean with these creatures, and you'll hear in his presentation and his enthusiasm how much he loves working with these sea creatures. So, Jack, I'm going to turn it over to you right now. Off you go.
fantastic. And I'm gonna share my screen.
And just remind you once again, feel free to use the Q&A anytime during the lecture and type in your questions.
All right, I'm just gonna hide a couple things. Oh no. All right, that should just about do it. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Jack, and I'm really excited to be speaking to you guys today. And my topic is going to be on reproductive biology in the ocean. And it's, I think, a fascinating lens through which, you know, I love to examine marine biology. And just the different ways that all of these animals reproduce is just fascinating. The diversity is awesome. And, you know, if you guys have half as much fun listening to this as I had creating this talk for you guys, then we're all going to have a great night tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to get started here. There we go. Great. So the plan for today, we are going to first do a little like reproduction crash course and learn about it in general. Then we're gonna, you know, pick some interesting case studies of marine species and how they reproduce. And then at the end, I'd like to talk about a few issues that are affecting reproduction in the ocean. And I like to start by saying that reproduction is the creation of new individuals, and that sounds, sort of like a broad definition, but the ways in which animals reproduce in the ocean and elsewhere sort of necessitates that sort of broad definition there. Let's see. Yeah, we have like crabs over here copulating, and then on the right we have slipper limpets, which are native to Nantucket, which lay eggs on top of each other. And so you'll see throughout the talk that there's just so many different ways in which these animals reproduce. But let's start by talking about some of the sort of aspects that we need to know about when we talk about reproduction. And the first is whether it's sexual reproduction or asexual reproduction. And sexual reproduction implies fertilization, so there's eggs and sperm, and then the result of fertilization is the offspring. But there's also asexual reproduction where there's no fertilization involved. And here we have an example of two sea anemones that used to be one individual. Lots of anemones can reproduce through this method called radial fission, in which one individual basically copies itself and then sort of pulls itself apart, creating two identical clones. And some anemones in the intertidal, you form huge colonies, all genetic clones of each other from one original individual that settled down there. Then we talk about fertilization, right? We need to know, is the fertilization internal, inside the body of one of these organisms, or external? External fertilization is extremely common in the marine environment. A lot of animals reproduce through broadcast spawning, where they release eggs and sperm into the water column and allow fertilization just to happen, sloshing around in the water column. And external fertilization is kind of risky, just because fertilization rates can be affected by, tides and things like that. So it's kind of a risky method, but very, very common in the ocean. Let's see, now we'll talk about the difference between fecundity and fertility. And fecundity is the reproductive potential in an animal. So fecundity is affected by how much eggs an animal is able to produce, sperm viability, and things like that. Fecundity is talking about the physiology of an animal, whereas fertility is the observed reproductive output. So there are animals that have high fecundity that can produce a bunch of eggs, but they may release the eggs into the water column and all the eggs get eaten before they can hatch into offspring, in which case you can have high fecundity and lower fertility. And that's a really important distinction because there's lots of animals in the ocean with high fecundity, but the actual fertility rates are much lower because their eggs are getting eaten or thrown away and things like that, or washed away. Parental effort is really important as well. And as y'all might imagine, when we talk about parental effort, we can refer to behaviors, animals that swim across the world to reproduce in a safe location are providing parental effort. When, a northern pufferfish defends its eggs in the eelgrass beds, that's parental effort. And we do also see, formal parental care in the ocean. It's just extremely rare and mostly limited to mammals. So, whales and seals and dolphins and things all undergo formal, parenting. But usually in fish and invertebrates, it's pretty rare to have, parents raising offspring. Another interesting and important part of parental care is physiological parental effort. So when an animal produces offspring that are really well developed, that is a form of parental care. So pipefish, for example, when their offspring are miniature, pipefish, they don't have a larval phase. So they're very well developed and therefore more well equipped to survive whereas something like tuna produces tons of offspring, but they're, larvae, and most of them don't survive because they're not as well developed. And we also see provisioning, which is parents passing down mostly like nutrients and raw materials to their eggs so that their offspring are more likely to survive. And there are a lot of animals out there that perform more provisioning or provision their offspring better when the parent is experiencing environmental stressors. So provisioning is important form of parental effort as well. Maturation is really important as well. As you can imagine, when animals reach sexual maturity more quickly, the population is able to reproduce quicker, which is really helpful.
Jack? Hey, Jack, excuse me. We can't hear your voice right now. Say something. Talk for a minute, Jack.
Can you hear me?
Now we can hear you. Go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, great. So
You
I don't
probably
know.
need the last minute or so, Jack. You might want to back up one slide, maybe.
So I guess I'll start here. So parental effort is really important, and there's a bunch of different sort of categories of parental effort. As you can imagine, when animals swim across the world to go to their breeding ground, and their breeding ground is this like beautiful, safe, secluded area, that's parental effort because their offspring are going to be born in a safe location. There are more formal behaviors too, like defending eggs or brooding. And then there's rarely formal parental care in the marine environment. So, and that's mostly limited to mammals like whales, dolphins, sea otters, and things like that are doing most of the parental care. It's extremely rare in fish and invertebrates. But when we talk about parental effort too, we also are talking about physiological effort. So when animals have really well-developed offspring, they're putting a lot of energy into making their offspring, viable. So that's a high amount of parental effort per individual. But we also talk about provisioning, which is when usually the mother gives like extra nutrients and materials to the eggs so that the offspring might have a bigger yolk when it's born or something like that. So it just makes the offspring more viable. All right. Maturity is extremely important, and some animals can reach sexual maturity in weeks, and others take a little bit longer. The leatherback sea turtle, for example, can take 15 to 25 years to reach sexual maturity. So you can imagine a huge portion of the population is not reproducing. So it makes that population vulnerable. If something were to kill off most of the adults in the population, it would take a much longer time for those animals to bounce back. So maturation is really important as well. And and survival rate is also really important because the animals need to be able to survive until they can reproduce. So this, for example, is a barnacle larva, and larvae like this typically have a very low survival rate. Barnacles, maybe like 2% or less of them survive to be an adult. So you can imagine why it's important to have maximum offspring if the survival rate is 2%. Great. And sort of synthesizing these concepts together, we have sort of a spectrum of reproductive strategies, and pardon the scientific terms, but K-selection or K-selected species are species like humans and mammals with low fecundity, so they're not making many offspring. They mature slowly generally. There's a lot of parental effort in terms of either behavior or physiological parental effort, and have relatively high survival rates. And K-selection is most viable of a reproductive strategy in stable environments. So if, like I was kind of saying before, if there's huge, abiotic upheavals where the population dies out and you're a K-selected species, it takes much longer to bounce back. And on the other hand, we have R-selected species, which they have high fecundity, so they're making tons of offspring. Typically, those offspring reach sexual maturity very quickly, very low parental effort. Usually the survival rate is really low. And this strategy is best in unstable environments. So if large swaths of the population die off, the high fecundity and the quick maturation enable that population to potentially bounce back much more quickly. And so if we put it on sort of a spectrum, because not all species are K-selected or R-selected, I'm just going to list some sort of familiar organisms. Humans and mammals in general are sort of the apex of K-selection, with maximum parental effort, slow maturation, low fecundity. Usually mammals have less than 10 offspring at a time. So they're definitely high up on the list in K-selection. Also K-selected are things like birds that have fewer offspring. Birds tend to have some sort of parental care as well. Reptiles have slightly more offspring and generally, and less parental effort. Amphibians, they have large clutches of eggs usually. The offspring aren't very well developed, and the survival rate's pretty low. And then sort of moving towards our selection, we have things like insects and spiders that have lots of offspring usually. They often have, in immature sort of larval phases in which the animal is really vulnerable and weak. But they reach sexual maturity really, really quickly, usually within a year. And sort of on the right side, all the way on the right side of the spectrum, most marine organisms tend to be R-selected to a wide extent. So fishes, mollusks, crustaceans, worms, like jellyfish, all these things produce tons and tons of offspring. There are some exceptions. Sharks, for example, have small litters, and baby sharks are miniature forms of the adult and can hunt and are pretty well developed. But for the most part, the predominant reproductive strategy is this sort of R selection in the ocean. And I think now I'm going to move on and talk about some really interesting case studies about how some of these marine animals reproduce. And I'm going to start with the Atlantic horseshoe crab. And if you have been around the beaches in Nantucket in the late spring and early summer, I'm sure you've seen them crawling around. Horseshoe crabs can grow, a few feet long. They're really cool. They're basically living fossils. They've been around for 450 million years, which, to put that in perspective, is, hundreds of millions of years before dinosaurs. And actually, when horseshoe crabs first evolved, there's like no carnivores on land, right? All of the carnivores are still in the ocean at this point. So the way they reproduce is actually a legacy of the fact that they evolved in this time where there's very few predators. And so the way these guys reproduce is usually in the late spring and summer, when the water warms up. They come inshore and look for mates. And the male is usually smaller and looks for a female. And you'll see him like this. The male has a special, like, kind of boxing glove hook structure that he uses to attach to the back of the female. And they don't produce eggs immediately. What they do is they wait for the perfect tide, and they actually synchronize their spawning with the moon cycle. And they come up onto the beaches during the highest tides of the season. So they come up around full and new moons, and they get up as high as possible onto the beach. And the female will deposit her eggs, and the male will fertilize them externally. And then they both leave, and the eggs sit under the sand for a couple weeks. And then when another sort of spring tide comes, then they hatch, and the little baby horseshoe crabs swim off. But 450 million years ago, this was an excellent strategy for reproduction, because they're literally getting their eggs as far away from all of the predators in the ocean. And there was really, at the time, not much to worry about, depositing your eggs outside of the water. And here's an image from Delaware. The Delaware Bay has the highest sort of concentration of horseshoe crabs in the United States. And so sometimes, when the horseshoe crabs are breeding, they'll cover the entire beach. But their reproductive success is really important. There are tons of animals that eat the eggs that really can't live without them. Most notably, the red knot, which is a migratory shorebird that stops usually in the Delaware area, but also elsewhere, and feeds predominantly on horseshoe crab eggs, and the eggs are full of protein and nutrients, so that they have the strength to continue on with their migration. And we've seen declines in the red knot population, where there were declines in horseshoe crabs. So they're very, very, the two species are very well connected, and the success of the horseshoe crab spawn is really important for these birds and for other animals. There's fish and things like fiddler crabs that also rely on the horseshoe crab eggs as well. All right, moving on. I couldn't help myself but talk about comb jellies. I am fascinated by comb jellies. I did some research on them. Comb jellies are a group of gelatinous animals, commonly mistaken for true jellyfish, but actually more closely related to sea sponges. And so they're different from real jellyfish. They don't have stinging cells. They're bilaterally symmetrical instead of radially symmetrical. And they're way more ancient than true jellyfish as well. This species is Mimeopsis ladii. The internet tells me that the common name is sea walnut, but I have to date never heard anyone refer to them as a sea walnut. But they're really cool animals. Even though they kind of look like a torpedo or an arrow, they swim lobes first. So this individual would swim to the left, and they create a current of water into their stomach to catch plankton. So those little dots in the center of the animal on the screen are prey items that it's been eating. And comb jellies, or at least the species of comb jelly, is really interesting. They are simultaneous hermaphrodites. So they produce eggs and sperm concurrently, and they spawn every day. So they release either eggs or sperm once a day. And they usually flip back and forth. And usually when you see comb jellies, you see them in huge sort of swarms, hundreds or thousands of them in the area. So they're all together, they're all spawning all the time. So there's very high fertilization rates. It's a really interesting strategy. What's interesting is when you take two of them and put them together and put them in a tank or something and separate them. This was just found, I think, last year. And you can imagine if you have two comb jellies together and they both decide to release sperm, or both decide to release eggs, that there, no fertilization can occur, and it's extremely ineffective. But we found out that apparently when you put two comb jellies together, they will almost always match up. So one of them will be the male for the day, and one of them will be the female for the day. And then the next day they both switch. And so if it were up to random chance, half the time they would be, releasing the same type of gamete, and fertilization wouldn't occur. But somehow these brainless, heartless, gelatinous animals have some sort of chemical sex language or something where they can determine who's going to be the male for the day and who's going to be the female for the day. And we really don't understand it, but it's really cool that these really, really simple animals have, complex sexual behavior. And I think it's really cool. And this species, by the way, very common on Nantucket. They're here almost year round. And if you see them at the beach, go back to the beach at night, and if you poke them, they flash bright green. They're really cool. Alrighty, moving on. So now I'm going to talk about barnacles. Barnacles are really interesting animals. This is a larval barnacle that we saw before, and they have a pretty cool life cycle. So when they're born, they're these little, they call them anopleus, and they swim around eating phytoplankton mostly. And they go through a bunch of different phases. They shed their exoskeleton and develop for a few weeks in the water column. And then they find a nice place to settle, a rock or the bottom of the boat or something. And they settle head first, create a shell around them, and then feed with their legs. And if you haven't seen barnacles feeding before, they're pretty cool. And they're basically our filter feeders. So they're literally catching plankton and other organic material in the water column and eating them. And what's interesting about barnacles is that, most sessile, most stationary animals, like mussels and oysters broadcast spawn. So they all just release their eggs and sperm into the water column and hope that fertilization occurs. This is a sessile type of organism that actually undergoes sexual behavior. And, if you're wondering how a barnacle can, copulate with another individual, they actually have the longest penises relative to their body size in the animal kingdom. And so that allows individuals to, give their sperm to barnacles 2 or 3 individuals over. And barnacles are also simultaneous hermaphrodites. So they can deliver sperm and receive sperm within a very short time frame. So really cool animals. And then they'll release their larvae, and then the larvae get swept away and produce new barnacle colonies elsewhere in the environment. Now I want to talk about a parasite, and everybody loves parasites, I know. But this one's really interesting. I'm going to talk about a tapeworm called Schistocephalus. I always get mixed up on that. And Schistocephalus is a common marine tapeworm. And I have to mention that this is not a species that can parasitize humans, so nothing to worry about. And these are really cool worms. So they start life as little eggs floating around in the water. And tons of things in the ocean eat eggs, jellyfish and mussels and clams and oysters and fish. Tons of filter feeders, gobble up the eggs, and the eggs, get eaten and die. But if the eggs are eaten by a copepod, which is a tiny marine crustacean, then they can infect the copepod and hatch into little tiny worms. And once inside the copepod, the worms grow, and they manipulate the behavior of their host. So copepods that are infected with the worms have reduced responses to stressors. So usually copepods will, flee in terror if something like vibrates the water or something like that. But copepods that are infected have reduced stress responses and are sort of generally lethargic. And that allows the copepod to be eaten by its next host, the 3-spined stickleback. And keep in mind, if that copepod is eaten by any other animal, the worms just, get digested alive. But if the copepod is eaten by one of these 3-spined sticklebacks, then the worms can, parasitize this fish and grow and progress in their life cycle. And once inside the stickleback, they get really big. The sticklebacks themselves are, 3.5 inches usually. And the tapeworms can actually grow longer than their host in the gut. And some fish we found, are parasitized by 15 of these worms. And the worms modify this host as well. So not only is the large bulge in the gut make it so that the fish has trouble swimming, but sticklebacks with these worms inside of them have reduced stress responses like the copepod, but also are more likely to engage in risky behavior. So if some kind of predator comes nearby, and usually, these three-spine sticklebacks, hang out together. If a predator comes, all the other sticklebacks will swim away, and the parasitized ones will try to eat that last barnacle before the predator comes, and do risky things. And that makes them more likely to get eaten. This is the second intermediate host. And where the worms really want to be is inside the gut of, I forgot to show you guys the worms. Oh my goodness. So this is the relative size of the tapeworms inside of the stickleback. So you can see they're really huge. But going back, so these worms, right, want the stickleback to be eaten by shorebirds. So they can go into seagulls and terns and herons and things like that. And it is finally inside the gut of these birds that these worms, meet up with local singles in their area and can finally reproduce after going through 2 intermediate hosts. And so in areas where these tapeworms are common, there's a very high prevalence of parasitism within shorebirds in the area. But what's interesting is that sometimes, the tapeworm will get eaten by the bird, and the tapeworm, gets into the gut, and it's the only one there, or it's the first one to arrive. But, the species is perfectly happy to throw a party of one. They are simultaneous hermaphrodites and can self-fertilize. So they can reproduce with themselves if there are no mates. And of course, if there are other individuals, they prefer to mate with other individuals, but they can self-fertilize, which is crazy, very, very rare in any type of animal, but also rare even within the hermaphroditic animals. So it's really cool. And then the offspring or the eggs are passed through the bird and come out with the feces into the water, ideally. But if the bird poops over land, that's just about the end of those eggs' existence. But ideally, they get back into the ocean and can, start to parasitize those copepods again. But parasites are really gross, but they're really cool and really important. So without these parasites, scientists think that the 3-spine stickleback populations would just totally explode. As their name suggests, they have these, gnarly spines coming out of their back. And so nothing really likes to eat them. So if, these tapeworms weren't here helping limit the populations, then, there might be, imbalance in the ecosystem. So tapeworms are really important. Cool. So I'm going to take a brief pause. And for those of you who signed up to this lecture and did not think we would be talking about worms parasitic worms reproducing with themselves inside of birds, I'm going to ask you to bear with me because things are about to get weird. That brings me to the anglerfish. And the anglerfishes are really cool deep sea fish. They get their name because they have a bioluminescent lure coming out of their head to lure innocent, curious fish and invertebrates to their gruesome demise. They're famous for their fang-like teeth. They can distend their jaw and their gut to eat things larger than themselves and are generally the nightmares of the deep. And this animal is really interesting, right? The fish I just described to you is the female. The female is the terror of the deep. The male, in comparison, is actually kind of this, pathetic pipsqueak of a fish. The males are usually around 1/10 of the size of the females. They have a brief larval and juvenile stage sort of towards the surface of the water, usually, like 100 feet deep or something like that. And then, after that juvenile stage, they do not eat ever again in their life and descend into the ocean or into the abyss with only one mission, and that's to find a female. And so the males, right, don't have a bioluminescent esca. They don't have any teeth. So they're pretty, pathetic in terms with respect to the female. But right, so they're down there. They're looking for the female anglerfish. Fortunately, the females have the bioluminescent esca, basically like a little lighthouse that guides the males. The females are also pretty stinky, so that helps as well. Because the females are so few and far between that the males really need to utilize everything they can to find a mate. And so eventually, hopefully, the male will find a female before starving. And this is where things get weird. So the male will find a female and he bites her. And he can bite her anywhere, on the top, on the sides, on the bottom, usually not in the face, but he can bite her just about anywhere. And that is his last action as a free individual. What happens next is, I don't know, bizarre and kind of horrifying. But after he bites her, the circulatory system of the female penetrates the male through the mouth and slowly begins conquering his body. And his organs, his brain and heart and liver all begin to atrophy and wither away as she sort of conquers him physiologically. But there's only one thing that's important, and that's his testes. And once the circulatory system gets there, it's delivering nutrients to the testes so they can produce sperm. And actually, his gonads continue to develop even though the rest of the fish is more or less dead. And she basically can reproduce with him whenever she wants. So it's pretty weird. And if you guys were pretty observant, you may have noticed the male in the picture here. There he is, poor guy. And so it's really weird situation. It's like sort of an intraspecies parasitism or something. Scientists like to say that the male is the parasite. And, if I can put my 2 cents in, a parasitism, right, is a parasite is an animal or an organism that derives benefit at the expense of its host. And I'm really not sure how much benefit these poor male fish are getting. They are tiny, defenseless, spend most of their life starving, and basically wither away and die once they, bite onto the female. And he doesn't even get to choose if and when he reproduces. And I don't know, if you're asking me, this does not look like the glamorous life of a parasite deriving benefit from another individual, but whatever it's called, it's definitely weirdness for sure. And I think I want to sort of finish with something a little bit more romantic, which brings me to seahorses. This one in the picture is the lined seahorse, which is native to Nantucket, but more common further south. And they're here. They're just pretty rare. But seahorses have really, really, really cute reproductive behavior. The lined seahorse, for example, gets maybe 4 inches long. And when the male seahorses are about a year old, they begin scooting around the eelgrass bed looking for a female. And once he finds a female, he'll try to impress her. He grabs her by the tail and dances his heart out. And sometimes the female will say, buzz off, your dancing skills suck, and he's bummed and swims away. But eventually he'll seduce a girl, and once the female indicates that she's interested in him, that's the beginning of a lifelong relationship. So like lined seahorses are monogamous, and it's really, really cute. So every morning, the male reasserts his commitment to her. He grabs her by the tail and dances a beautiful little morning dance. When they're lifelong partners, so if a storm comes through the eelgrass bed, they grab onto the eelgrass, but they also make sure that they're wrapped around each other. So if they're swept away together. And when they're ready to reproduce, the female will give the male her eggs. And you can see the male on the right here. This is not the lion seahorse. This is a different species. But the male seahorses have this big pouch to hold all of the eggs. And once she's delivered the eggs, the male fertilizes them internally from within the pouch and broods them usually for like a week to week or two, and swims around all pregnant. They're really, really cute. And yeah, after a couple weeks or so, the males give live birth, which is very rare in the marine environment, especially within fishes. And the offspring, they usually produce a couple, maybe like 100 or so individuals, and they're miniature seahorses. They're not larval. They're already juvenile seahorses, so they're capable of swimming and grabbing onto things with their tails, and they begin feeding immediately on little invertebrates and plankton and things like that. So really interesting reproductive strategies. Seahorses are one of the species that, relatively speaking, are more K-selected in the marine environment. Awesome. So now I want to talk about some of the issues that are affecting reproduction in the ocean. And the first one that came to my mind was rising sea temperatures. And this is a graph that shows temperature anomaly, which is sort of the change in temperature relative to arbitrary average. So relative to this late 1900s average, you can see the average sea surface temperatures are increasing by, let's see, it's increased almost 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit, or 0.6, 0.7 degrees Celsius, just since the 1960s. So it doesn't sound like much, but most marine organisms are cold-blooded. So when the environmental temperatures increase, so does their body temperature, and that increases their metabolism, which means they are spending more energy and calories every day on basic bodily functions. So if they're not getting more food, then they have to find that energy somewhere. So they either grow less quickly, or in a lot of cases, we're finding in experimental studies that a lot of animals, when they're experiencing higher temperatures, are spending less energy on making eggs. So their fecundity is reducing, which is unfortunate and troubling. And but probably the most disturbing impact of rising sea temperature with respect to reproduction is its disruption of plankton bloom timing. And so usually in temperate oceans, phytoplankton, which are microscopic photosynthetic organisms, bloom in the spring and summer when there's a lot of nutrients and sunlight. But if sea temperatures increase, these blooms will occur earlier. And that might sound like a benefit, superficially, but it's actually really troubling, because a lot of the animals that reproduce and have planktonic stages, like the barnacles we saw, and and things like mussels and clams and oysters, and lobsters, crabs, so many different types of animals that have larval stages, time their reproduction such that the offspring are born into the height or the peak of the plankton blooms. So if these plankton blooms occur earlier, and all of the plankton bloom and then drop off before all of these larvae come in, then the larvae won't have anything to eat, and a lot of them will starve. And a recent sort of model predicted that on average, in most temperate oceans, that phytoplankton blooms are going to occur 16 days earlier on average. So if animals aren't able to evolve and shift the timing in which they reproduce, then there will, we call it trophic mismatch, where the animals are there looking for food and there's no food because they've missed out on their opportunity. Another thing I want to mention is ocean acidification. And this is the steady acidification of the ocean due to human emission of carbon dioxide, and the oceans absorb, around 25% of the carbon dioxide that's emitted into the atmosphere. And once carbon dioxide is in the ocean, it turns into carbonic acid and makes the ocean more acidic, which is especially troubling for calcifying organisms, shellfish and urchins and things like that. So specifically, there's a study that found that a lot of bivalves, which are the two-shelled animals like clams and scallops, if they're experiencing higher acidity levels, will spend more energy maintaining their shells, which are vulnerable to dissolution, but two, are spending more energy on provisioning their offspring. So between those two effects, they're making a lot less eggs. So the reproductive potential in those species is projected to be affected by ocean acidification. And there's an interesting study I read recently too that found that the swimming rate, the mobility of sperm in sea urchins is affected by ocean acidification. And under the sort of laboratory experimental conditions, they found that under the ocean acidification regime that's projected for 2100, that the mobility of the sperm is going to reduce 25%, which is troubling because the success of, or the fertilization rate highly depends on, the sperm being able to swim quickly and connect with the egg. So when you have the sperm swimming more slowly, there's less chances that a sperm is going to run into an egg in the water column. And let's see, we also have habitat destruction, yay. So habitat for, sea turtles, for example, is being made into resorts. Mangroves in tropical environments are hugely important for habitat for spawning and juvenile tropical fish and invertebrates, which are also being torn down to make resorts and fish farms and things like that. So that's really unfortunate. We also have light pollution, which is kind of an interesting issue that I like to bring up because it's sort of an issue that we feel here at the Murray-Mitchell Association because of the effect of light pollution on our ability to conduct astronomy. But light pollution also affects marine organisms. Corals, for example, or most corals, for example, use moonlight to coordinate their spawning so that all of the coral of one species spawn at once, so that the fertilization rate is really high because there's just tons of eggs and sperm in the water column. But in areas near cities and near resorts, the sort of ambient glow from these areas is confusing corals, and they're not all spawning at the same time. Some of them are spawning too early and some of them are spawning too late. So the fertilization rate is impacted by that. And not that corals needed any other stressors on them, but light pollution is affecting corals in localities near human development. And I also, before I ended, I wanted to mention the contributions of the Murray-Mitchell Association to our knowledge about reproduction. For I think about 10 years now, we've been doing horseshoe crab surveys in the spring and summer. This year is impacted by COVID-19, but we remain committed to doing these horseshoe crab spawning surveys, and we report our information to the regional authority that manages the horseshoe crab fishery. And so that's really important because horseshoe crabs, if they're not managed correctly, can plummet. Their blood is worth about $15,000 a quart. So if we're not careful, people are going to exploit them for their blood, but also they use them for bait as well. And I also wanted to mention the work of Dr. Valerie Hall, who does excellent work on scallop reproduction. And those of you who are familiar with Nantucket I'm sure know the iconically delicious Nantucket Bay scallop is super important to the island and elsewhere in New England. And Nantucket is really, the last place where they're found in enough numbers to have significant commercial fisheries. So, that work is really important to maintain their populations and make sure the fishery is sustainable. And that is about all I got. Thank you so much for listening and for bearing with us as we discovered the joys of Zoom. And yeah, I'm excited to answer some questions. Thank you guys so much.
So Jack, thank you so much. It's very hard for me because I know there were some gasps that were probably during some of your presentation, the parasite and the stickleback. Can you hear me, Jack?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So so you need to, let's see, Jack, there you go, perfect. So here we go. Jack, I unfortunately, exactly 5 seconds before you finished, my computer shut off and I had to jump back on. So all my Q&As disappeared. So do you mind just reading them yourself and answering those questions?
Yeah, sure. So, all right, it doesn't look like we have that many questions, so I'm gonna kind of go. Let's see, our first question is, what is the difference between spawning and brooding, right? So spawning is releasing gametes, eggs and sperm into, whereas brooding is a behavior where an animal, protects either its eggs or its young, on top of or around the animal. So for example, crabs, or most crabs, brood their eggs. So they have this apron on their underside, and you can usually see, hundreds or thousands of eggs under there. And that brooding protects the eggs from predation, but also they're able to, manipulate how much oxygen they're getting and things like that. So brooding is an awesome example of, parental effort. All right. Right, so we got another question. Thinking in regards to climate change, are case-selected marine species or R-selected marine species better adapted to the changes we expect, like or ocean warming and ocean acidification? That's a great question. So generally speaking, I would say that R-selected species are better adapted, and generally R-selected species are more resilient to abrupt changes. And while a lot of the changes that occur from climate change and ocean acidification are slow and chug along, we are also concerned with changes like heat waves that come through coral reefs and more frequent sudden changes, which the R-selected species are well suited for, but K-selected species, like sea turtles and sharks and marine mammals are not as good at. And that's, they also, thinking in terms of evolution, usually R-selected species, since they're reproducing so much, have some, more rolls of the dice, so to speak, some more chances to produce offspring that are a little bit better at dealing with these changes. So the K-selected species are, going to be impacted the most probably. We're already seeing like polar bears, for example, are being impacted by climate change, even though it's an issue that only began, depending on your perspective, but a couple hundred years ago. Right. See, how big are the jellies? And I'm assuming this is a reference to the ctenophores. The Mimeopsis, the sea walnut comb jellies, maybe get, I think the biggest one I saw was like 5 inches. Maybe they get a little bit more large than that, but on average, they're usually, 2, 3, 4 inches. All right. Do we know what causes the ctenophores to produce either eggs or sperm. So the ctenophores produce both, and they just basically choose to spawn or to release either the sperm or the eggs, but they have both at the same time and are producing both concurrently. All right, do the birds die because of the parasitic worm? So the parasites don't really kill the birds off, and that's to their advantage because they can live in the birds for years, and the birds fly around, pooping all over the ocean, and it distributes their eggs in a wide area, so they can parasitize copepods and fish, and ultimately get back into the birds. Whereas if the parasite killed off the bird, then that would be the end of the line for those adults reproducing. Is the use of chemical sunscreens harmful for coral reefs? Depends on the ingredients, but most sunscreens are harmful in some respect to corals. When you're shopping for sunscreens, usually you can look for like a little label that says reef safe somewhere on the bottom. But there are also resources online that give you a list of ingredients that are specifically harmful to corals so that you can compare that to sunscreen brands that you're thinking about. Are those little eyeballs in the slide? They absolutely are. So those are all baby clownfish, and they're almost ready to hatch. Great. So let's see. Why is the blood of the horseshoe crab so valuable? Great question. So the primary reason is because so the horseshoe crab blood has a molecule in it called LAL that reacts chemically with gram-negative bacteria. And so one of the biggest reason we harvest it from the horseshoe crabs is because medical companies will use the LAL and dribble a little bit of it onto medical syringes and vaccines and other equipment. And if they see it react chemically, they know there's gram-negative bacteria. So they use the blood as sort of a bacteria test. And, it's this awesome tried and true method, and it's, attributed with saving, tens of thousands of human lives since we've, come up with it. So the blood is also harvested for research purposes as well. How fragile is the acidity of the ocean? So the ocean is a giant solution. It's very well buffered, meaning that it can withstand a lot of acid before changing its pH. However, we are releasing so much carbon dioxide that the buffering capacity of the ocean, can't handle it. And so that's why ocean acidification is a problem. But generally speaking, it's very impervious to changes, from a chemical perspective, but our impact is so large that we are changing the pH of the ocean anyway. All right. Why are the invasive green crab reproducing so successfully in Nantucket waters? Awesome. So, so I don't know if the reproduction rate is any better here than elsewhere in its invasive range. But what we do know is that there are virtually no predators for the invasive green crab here. So, while, in Europe, where they're native, they're, parasitized by this crazy parasitic barnacle that castrates them. All of the animals over there know how to eat them. In Nantucket, they have very few predators here. So that's probably the #1 reason that they're so successful. But they're also, just really efficient hunters. They're, faster than a lot of our crabs, like the clumsy spider crab and things like that. So I would say that reproduction is not necessarily the reason why they're so common here. What is the most destructive human contribution to the aquatic ecosystem? that is a really tough question to answer. And, it depends entirely on perspective. You know, in the short term, our huge impacts that we've had pertain to overfishing and hunting. For example, in just a few decades, we hunted almost all of the sea otters on the west coast of the United States, which allowed the urchins to explode in population, and the urchins ate all the kelp, which destroyed that whole habitat. So in the short term, usually it's like direct, moving or removing of animals. But in the long term, it's hard to say. Ocean warming is going to have profound impacts. Ocean acidification as well. Sea level rise, even, we think of it as a human issue, but in a lot of cases, sea level is rising faster than corals can keep up with it. So the corals are relative to the sea surface sinking. So it's a complicated question, but if one of the answers is that we have to start going green and reduce our fossil fuel emissions and things like that. Cool. All right, we're getting towards the bottom here. What species local to Nantucket waters are most in danger due to environmental changes? We know about eelgrass reduction and its effect on scallops. Are there others? So yeah, I actually just read a study that suggested that ocean acidification, the acidity level estimated for 2100 is going to kill off between 25% and 50% of larval bivalves, including the Nantucket bay scallop was included in the study, but also, the quahogs and things like that. So, shellfish in general are in grave danger if we do not do anything about ocean acidification. I would say that's probably the biggest one specific to Nantucket and in the closest term. Cool. Can sharks get parasites? Just about every organism has parasites, and actually scientists estimate that 20% of all animal species are parasitic. So I would bet you that almost all adult sharks have parasites of some form, either worms or ciliates or something. But parasites are extremely common and really are important to helping maintain balance and making sure that no one species is able to reproduce out of control, because then the parasites reproduce and put a top-down limit on those. Great.
I think that's it, Jack, right?
Yeah, I think that there's one more question I'd like to answer. So what's the relationship between fecundity and longevity? And that's a really interesting question. I don't think that fecundity directly affects longevity, but usually animals with higher fecundity are more short-lived than animals with low fecundity. And so if you imagine, humans, for example, when, we reproduce, have, 1 to, rarely like 3 or 4 offspring at a time. So if we had a lifespan of 4 years, then, a single human could only produce a handful of offspring. So usually the ones with the higher fecundity are able to have shorter lifespans. And alrighty.
Great, Jack, thank you. Thank you so much. I just want to remind everyone that next week we have our next speaker, our second for the summer, and that's actually going to be on Wednesday, June 10th at 7 o'clock, and it's MMA's first astronomy research fellow, Jay Chatiti, will give a virtual lecture entitled Strange Signals and a Cosmic Conundrum, using fast radio bursts to uncover the universe's hidden matter. Jay will explain how astronomers are using these mysterious explosions, first known as fast radio bursts, to solve a separate enigma: where is the missing matter in our universe? So this will be a great talk. Jay recently led the MMA in publishing a paper of this groundbreaking results with Dr. Jorgensen. It's actually was covered in a lot of the popular press. So Don't miss this next week. Sign up for it next Wednesday at 7 o'clock. We really appreciate you all being here. If you love this program, of course, we love your support. Member, contribute to the Emergency Resiliency Fund, but we really appreciate it all. And we're so happy that you're here tonight. And thank you, Jack. That was a wonderful presentation and got us off to a great start this summer. Thank you all. Be safe. Have a good night.
Alrighty. All right, I'm gonna end it. Thank you so much, everyone. And if y'all have lingering questions, you can always email me at jdubinsky@mariahmitchell.org. So thank you, everyone, again. Good night.
Thanks, Jack.